When Eleanor's grandmother passed away, the family gathered to sort through her belongings. Among the heirlooms and keepsakes, Eleanor was surprised to be the sole inheritor of a particular item, an intricately crafted antique dollhouse. It was an exact replica of her grandmother's home, down to the smallest detail. Tiny curtains hung in the windows, miniature furniture filled the rooms, and even the wooden floorboards mirrored the creaks she had memorized during childhood visits. Eleanor was touched by the gesture, assuming it was her grandmother's way of passing down a cherished memory. Yet, as she studied it more closely, something felt off. Despite its beauty, the dollhouse exuded an unsettling aura, as if it were watching her. She chalked it up to nostalgia and placed it in her study, hoping to preserve her grandmother's memory. For the first few days, the dollhouse sat untouched. But strange things began to happen. One evening, Eleanor was in her study working late when she noticed something unusual. One of the tiny chairs in the dollhouse's dining room was overturned. She was sure all the furniture had been perfectly arranged when she first set it up. Assuming she must have bumped it, she reached in to fix the chair. But the next morning, when she walked into her real dining room, she tripped over one of her own chairs, which had somehow fallen onto its side overnight. At first, she dismissed the incident as a coincidence. But the peculiarities multiplied. The next day, the chandelier in the dollhouse's living room had fallen, its delicate crystals scattered across the floor. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor was reading in her own living room, a loud crash startled her. Looking up, she saw her real chandelier had plummeted to the ground, shattering inches away from where she sat. By now, Eleanor couldn't deny the connection. The dollhouse wasn't just a keepsake, it was a mirror of her home, predicting events before they happened. Curiosity turned to dread. Eleanor spent hours scrutinizing the dollhouse, afraid of what it might show next. The figurines inside unsettled her the most. Each room contained a tiny, lifelike figure representing someone in her home. Herself, her dog Charlie, and even her cleaning lady. The figurines sometimes shifted positions, though Eleanor never touched them. One night, Eleanor was jolted awake by a faint, rhythmic tapping. She followed the sound to the study and found the dollhouse glowing faintly, its windows illuminated from within. Pressing her face close to the glass, she saw flames flickering in the tiny kitchen. Panicking, Eleanor rushed to her real kitchen, expecting to find a fire. But everything was in order. When she returned to the study, the dollhouse's glow had faded and the flames were gone. Yet now, a new figurine had appeared in the kitchen, a miniature version of her, standing motionless in front of a stove. Eleanor's fear turned to desperation. She searched for answers in her grandmother's belongings and discovered an old weathered journal. Her grandmother had written about the dollhouse in detail, describing it as a gift that had been passed through the family for generations. But it wasn't a gift, it was a curse. The journal described how the dollhouse predicted tragedies, always starting small before escalating into disasters. It had been responsible for fires, deaths, and inexplicable accidents, always leaving its owner powerless to stop them. Her grandmother had tried to destroy the dollhouse many times, burning it, smashing it, even burying it. But each attempt failed. The dollhouse always reappeared, unscathed, waiting for its next victim. Determined to break the cycle, Eleanor tried everything. She threw the dollhouse into a river, only to find it waiting in her study the next morning, its floors damp and muddy. She set it on fire, watching it burn to ashes, but when she returned to the study, it was whole again, perched on her desk as if mocking her. The final straw came when a new figurine appeared, a man she didn't recognize, standing on the dollhouse's porch. Later that day, there was a knock at her real front door. She opened it to find a stranger, tall, with an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here for the dollhouse," he said. Eleanor slammed the door, her heart racing. She rushed back to the study, but the dollhouse was gone. In its place was a single note, written in her grandmother's handwriting. "The house chooses its next home. For a moment, Eleanor thought she was free. But that night, she dreamed of a new dollhouse. This one, a perfect replica of her office building. Inside were tiny figures moving through its halls, their faces eerily familiar. One of them was her. When Eleanor woke, she wasn't sure if it was a dream or a warning. But as she left for work that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dollhouse wasn't done with her. And somewhere, someone else was hearing a knock on their door, their nightmare just beginning. It was a late autumn night when Samuel stumbled onto the platform, his breath clouding in the chilly air. He was exhausted, the kind of tired that made his bones ache. The last train was waiting, its metallic sheen catching the faint glow of the platform's flickering lights. There was something off about the train. It was too pristine, its surfaces too polished, like it had been pulled out of another era. Samuel hesitated. The platform was deserted, and the silence stretched unnaturally thin. But the thought of waiting until morning for the next train pushed him forward. He stepped into the carriage, the doors hissing shut behind him. The interior was immaculate, brass railings, leather seats without a single crease, and ornate light fixtures that cast a warm golden glow. The faint scent of polish hung in the air. Only a handful of passengers sat scattered throughout, each one rigid and silent. Their faces were partially obscured by hats, collars, or the shadows from their positions. Samuel chose a seat near the middle of the car and settled in. He glanced around, hoping to catch someone's eye, but the other passengers seemed lost in their own worlds. One was reading a newspaper, though the pages didn't rustle as they were turned. Another stared out the window at the platform. But what unnerved Samuel most was the lack of sound. No hum of conversation, no shuffling of feet, not even the distant roar of the city. The train lurched forward. Samuel leaned against the window, expecting to see the city recede into the distance, but instead, the landscape dissolved into darkness. Not the kind of darkness one might see on an unlit road, but an infinite void, as though the train had left reality altogether. An hour passed, and Samuel's unease grew. He pulled out his phone, only to find it had no signal. The time was frozen at 11:11 p.m. A chill ran down his spine, and he looked up to see the passenger across from him lower their newspaper. Their face was wrong. At first glance, it seemed normal, but the longer Samuel looked, the more distorted it became. The features were out of alignment, as though a child had drawn a face and then smudged it with their hand. The passenger's lips twisted into a smile that stretched too far, exposing blackened gums and jagged teeth. Samuel quickly averted his eyes and stood. He decided to move to another car. Anything would be better than staying here. As he walked down the aisle, he felt the weight of the passengers' stares. One by one, they turned their heads to watch him pass, their necks moving with unnatural stiffness. The door to the next carriage wouldn't open. Samuel tugged at the handle, but it refused to budge. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that the passengers had risen from their seats. They stood in perfect unison, their unnatural smiles gleaming in the dim light. Panic set in. Samuel pounded on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He turned back to face the passengers, but they were gone. The car was empty now, eerily so. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping. Samuel turned toward the source and saw a shadowy figure at the far end of the car. Its form was indistinct, flickering like a faulty projection. Two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, locked onto him. The train jolted violently, and Samuel was thrown to the floor. When he looked up, the shadowy figure was closer, its form shifting and contorting like smoke caught in a breeze. A deep, guttural voice echoed in his mind, whispering words he couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. Samuel scrambled to his feet and ran back toward the door he had entered through. But when he reached it, The door opened to reveal the same carriage he was trying to escape. The passengers were back in their seats, their smiles wider, their eyes hollow and lifeless. A newspaper fluttered to the floor in front of him. The headline read, "Man disappears on last train, no trace found." Below the text was a grainy black and white photo of Samuel boarding the train. The intercom crackled to life. A voice, distorted and otherworldly, announced, "Next stop, nowhere!" Samuel tried to scream, but no sound came out. The passengers' laughter filled the carriage, low and sinister, as the train hurtled deeper into the infinite darkness. The mansion was a labyrinth of extravagance, filled with gilded mirrors, ornate chandeliers, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever. It was the perfect setting for an exclusive party, and Evelyn had been thrilled to get an invitation. Guests mingled in the grand ballroom, their laughter echoing off high ceilings, but Evelyn found herself wandering, drink in hand, down a quieter hall. She had always been curious, and the locked door at the end of the corridor seemed to beckon her. A faint scratching noise seeped from behind it, too faint to hear over the party's din, but enough to pique her interest. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then tried the handle. It didn't budge. Evelyn's curiosity grew when she noticed an old brass key sitting on a nearby table, as though left there just for her. She hesitated only for a moment before snatching it up and unlocking the door. Behind it was a narrow staircase spiraling downward, dimly lit by flickering sconces. The air grew colder as she descended, the muffled sounds of the party fading into silence. At the bottom of the stairs, Evelyn found herself in a room that felt out of place, too plain, too old, and heavy with the scent of damp wood. The room had no windows, only doors. Dozens of them. Each door was unique, some tall and slender, others wide and heavy, with strange markings etched into their frames. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from all directions. Evelyn hesitated, heart pounding, before choosing the nearest door. Behind it was another room, almost identical but with subtle differences. Walls darker, air staler. More doors lined this room too, and when she turned to retrace her steps, the door she'd entered from was gone. Panic began to set in as she opened another door and then another, each leading to a new but eerily similar room. The scratching sound followed her, growing louder and more distinct. Claws on wood, something moving closer. She tried marking the doors with a pen from her purse, but when she opened another, the marks had vanished. Her phone had no signal, and the battery drained faster than it should. Evelyn's breathing grew ragged as she realized she wasn't alone. A shadow darted past in her peripheral vision. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Or was there? One door slammed shut behind her, followed by another in the distance. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The scratching turned into faint whispers. She bolted through another door, then another, desperate to escape, but the maze seemed endless. In one room, she found an old mirror leaning against the wall. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, thinking it might reflect an escape route. But the image in the glass wasn't hers. It was her, but not her. The reflection smiled, even though she wasn't. Its eyes were sunken, its movements delayed as though it was watching her from another place entirely. When she turned away, the figure in the mirror stepped out. She screamed and ran, but the maze twisted and turned, disorienting her further. The doors began opening on their own, revealing horrors behind them. A dark room filled with bloodied handprints, a flickering light illuminating piles of broken glass, and once, a figure slumped in the corner that vanished when she blinked. Hours, or was it days, passed, and Evelyn grew weaker, the maze sapping her strength. Her thoughts turned to the party above. Was anyone looking for her? Did they even notice she was gone? Finally, she stumbled into a room that felt different. A single door stood open, and beyond it, she could see the staircase leading back up. Relief flooded her as she sprinted toward it, ignoring the whispers begging her to stay. She burst back into the mansion's corridor, gasping for air. The sounds of the party returned, laughter and music flowing like a balm. But something was wrong. As she entered the ballroom, the guests stopped and turned to stare. Their faces were hollow, their smiles unnatural, their eyes dark and glassy. One by one, they raised their glasses in a silent toast, their movements stiff and synchronized. Evelyn turned to run, but the doors to the ballroom had vanished. Behind her, a faint scratching sound began again, echoing through the mansion. The maze wasn't done with her yet.